Welcome to Gradient Proof, a long-form discussion on a range of topics from AI to philosophy to entrepreneurship. We start each podcast sober and let the proof gradient the course of discussion. As always, we encourage you to drink with us. Welcome to the Gradient.
Our conversation is going to kind of build upon a little bit what we spoke about last time. And as you mentioned, a lot of exciting things have been happening, particularly around the space of ChatGPT. GPT-4 was released by OpenAI Institute on March 14th, right? And today we're going to talk a little bit about that and the overall journey toward what we can maybe call general artificial intelligence, and where we kind of see these different things moving, right? But pulling back again, so GPT-4 was released on March 14th. It's an improvement upon what is GPT 3.5, which we talked about last time, and it's more commonly known as ChatGPT, right, or GPT Plus, and has kind of taken the world by storm in terms of user interaction and use, whether it be in the workplace or just recreationally, or certainly as a topic of discussion in media more generally, right? But GPT-4 has been released. It's multimodal, which is a little bit different than 3.5. Multimodal in this case means that you can feed it text prompts, or you can provide it images, right? And it's capable of interacting with both types of content, right? Interestingly enough, last time we talked about Max Tegmark and the book Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Max is also founder and present president of the Future Life Institute, which looks at artificial intelligence and other existential risks facing humanity. And again, a couple days after the release of GPT-4 on March 14th, on March 22nd, they published an open letter calling for a 6-month moratorium on AI research, particularly GPT research. And this letter has gotten 30,000 signatures. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Roy?
Yeah, definitely. So very interesting times. And it seems really now we're at really the forefront. We're a few months in of this being released. But you could say we're, technologically decades. The advancement has been so extreme, right? And, let's say you look at those different nodes that are being developed out, right? Text, imagery, even just actions. There's a bunch of other companies and startups that are developing more specific developments in, let's say, construction or real estate or business. Even on the relationship level, there's, friend AIs that are being developed. And you've had, I think there's a case of somebody who killed themselves because they had this great friend in AI form, and then they changed the algorithm or the business pivoted, and then you see this, person lose a companion, right? Which could obviously be traumatic. But I guess where I'm going with this is there's all these different little nodes that are being developed out, kind of in their own silos. And what's going to be interesting, and I think this is really what general intelligence will be, is the combination of these different nodes into something larger, right? Mm-hmm. And I do want to talk about the kind of the pushback here. From those 30,000 signatures. But before we jump into that, maybe we can delve into how maybe some of these nodes come together into something interesting. So currently you're prompting, the AI in some way, and it's developing something, producing something. And the beauty of that, and I think one of the biggest advancements from search, is when you search something, it's a single query, right? And then in order to build on top of that, you've got to then modify the query, and you probably have to keep some of the old query in it so that it's working off of that same thing, right? So, for example, what's the color of the sky, and then what paint should I use wouldn't work because they're not connected, right? But if you're having this conversation like you are now with the ChatGPT interface, it could build off of that and make those connections. So I guess what will be interesting is there's also AutoGPT, which essentially will go and continue to develop out tasks, right? So research the best way to launch a brand. It may do that initial research, choose the best method, and then actually start to implement some of those tasks within it. So I guess, what will be interesting is, let's say in the next 5 years, which could be a millennia in, the scope of the development here, how do these things play out? Do you end up having if humans are needed at all, essentially one person, or I guess the amount you could achieve with one person versus a an office or a family or whatever it is, being able to develop those out, fairly quickly. Obviously because the interesting thing about, I think what makes ChatGPT and AI very interesting is it's already read the manual, as quote unquote, right? Mark Cuban said he got really rich because he read the manual on broadcasting and things that people wouldn't do, and then he found that opportunity because he was able to access all the available data and understand the openings and closing of that, right? And you see the same thing now with people want to access ChatGPT and AI, and they're not able to do it because maybe they don't understand how the prompting works. So they hire prompt engineers at exorbitant amounts of money in order to be able to actually use the tool successfully, right? So having a companion there who can actually go and understand all those different things that you didn't even know were available, but understands them not only in that specific region, but also potentially other other fields as well, I think is incredibly interesting. So I don't know, if you'd like, we can maybe plug it into some potential examples and share a little bit of futurist. But how do you see that playing out as far as the future of AI and being able to connect these different modules, maybe compare it to something in your life or something you see interesting?
No, understood. And maybe one way to kind of explore this a little bit is, jumping back to, you mentioned prompt engineers, right? And we, in the media, you kind of see the discussion about different prompt engineering jobs that pay $300,000 a year, right? And this is of course a relatively new skill set, right? Being that most prompt engineers weren't prompting, shall we speak, before August, September of last year at the earliest, right? And but they kind of have the ability to kind of construct that type of referential query that builds upon itself, as you mentioned, to produce, maybe a marketing strategy or some other type of output, right? What I think is interesting in thinking about examples is both in terms of how humans interact with GPT or ChatGPT or large language models more generally. I think what we're going to see is this unique moment where, yes, you can command $300,000 a year as a prompt engineer, but what will be interesting to me is 12 to 18 months out, I think we all become prompt engineers, meaning that our capability in terms of being able to interact with a greater and greater degree of sophistication to elicit a type of output is going to increase more generally, right? And in that immediate moment, you're probably going to see some of these prompt engineering jobs kind of disappear as it becomes folded into a larger skill set of what you're expected to know. For example, if you work in finance, you're expected to know Microsoft Excel, right? Or if you work in, other industries, you need to know how to use PowerPoint or Word, right? This is just going to be another digital skill in the toolbox, right?
Right. Now, and one thing that's interesting about that is when you go and prompt, and I guess in some ways we're all prompt engineers for Google or search, and some people are going to get better results based on how they craft it, right? But you could almost argue that we may not even know the best way to ask the question, and that some of the realities that exist in our life could actually be that input as well as part of the prompt. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're not feeling good and you go in and ask, why am I not feeling good? That doesn't give, the processor really any input, right? But if you had the ability to track all these variances, in your body, and it had a track record of different things you ate, how much you exercise, different things like that, your previous medical history, all those things, and then that could then be plugged in, be very fine-tuned and specific based off of your actual history and environment and things of that nature, right? It would know that, okay, maybe you don't work out enough. Maybe you live in a city that has poor air quality. Maybe you, have been eating really poorly the last few days. And all those things could then be part of the prompt, essentially, to then be able to actually answer that question more successfully versus why am I not feeling good today alone by itself. So it's almost like the prompt could come from not only the kind of text input, right, which is, essentially broken down, summarized version of what you're actually trying to achieve, right? But you could use the same example of how do I improve my business, right? Well, okay, a lemonade stand is going to have a different answer than a Fortune 500 company, right? But if you had the processing AI on that end, being able to take all those things into account, the answers are going to be much more different and calculated based on relevance, right? Even to the fact of, let's say you had your entire financials, everyone in your company, they understood how much that person worked, didn't work, what kind of role they played throughout the entire company for each employee, and then they could calculate then some kind of response, based on the reality, right? And we've talked about this before. One of the issues with like a lot of the advice you'll see today is people say, oh, you've got to wake up at 5 a.m. or you've got to do, work 16 hours a day or whatever it might be, right? Those are still generalized, even if it's a large swath of whoever that person's audience is. There's still an audience outside of that, or maybe one that's not in that specific point in their life or career or whatever it might be, that advice could actually be harmful, right? If you work the midnight shift, it probably doesn't make sense for you to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning because you're probably not sleeping much, which would then affect X, Y, and Z, right? So having more specific and actual responses to the reality of the prompter's life or question,
Sure.
I think would make a huge difference, right? So that's also an additional node, right? I think now what we're doing is we're developing out the nodes and the connections that are within image and text and data and knowledge, things like that are happening kind of behind the screen. But what's before then, I think will also be developed so that all those things can then be prompted into whatever that query might be.
Sure. Thinking about different applications, and I think we can both agree that this is going to be a game changer for many, if not all, industries, right? And when I say all industries, I add the usual caveat where they say probably industries that are going to be least likely to be affected are going to be those industries that involve more obvious manual or direct matter manipulation. So, for example, somebody that does construction, right, is probably not going to be as displaced by a GPT, large language model, than, a white collar worker, right? Both McKinsey and Goldman have come out with fairly bullish reports arguing that in the United States, right, large language models like GPT will add 7% economic growth, right, over the next 10 years. And again, that's an additive above what it would have been achieved otherwise, right? So there's going to be a big potential dividend, right? The question becomes, though, is with that, like any new technology and any large kind of paradigm shifting technology, right? There's going to be opportunities and efficiencies, but there's also going to be potential different displacement, right? And it's interesting how where we've seen this reference quite directly in the last couple of months is with the writers' strike. In California, right, and elsewhere, of course, where some of the union considerations have specifically referenced, right, the non-use or qualified use or required participatory understanding of, big production studios cannot just simply run off, right, and use some form of large language model to kick out television or movie scripts, right, in a way that displaces what is the role of the script writer today. Right.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think what's interesting about, maybe we zoom out for a second. So, if you look geopolitically, where the United States has been over the last 250 so years, there's essentially been this moment of very little serious competition, and if you bake this into what any kind of halt or limitation here is, you're essentially giving others who are looking to displace you on a global field the opportunity to get ahead, right? Who won't have these same resistance and things of that nature. So, in a world where you are the only country and there's no one else who can potentially eat your lunch, sure, you have that affordability, you have that ability to then say, okay, we're going to limit certain things and scale growth as needed. But at this point, and this may be our biggest mistake yet, is that the cat is out of the bag. Right now, people have seen how this can work. I mean, it's, I think, clear to a lot of people how this comes together. It does worry a large subset of certain industry that say, hey, we've spent X amount of time being able to develop these skills, and now these skills are essentially wiped off because we have enough data and information to go back and scrape and combine and be able to create great films, great be a great legal attorney, do all these things where you can become extremely more efficient, right? And I guess you could take the stance of is a human supposed to be doing those jobs if you can do it way more efficiently, right? And I think we talked about this before. The word computer used to be someone who would compute equations or whatever that might be, and now computer is obviously seen more so as the thing that powers the chips and almost everything in our lives, right? So the union for human computers is non-existent and not even on the mind of, I would say, modern Americans or humans, right? Because it's silly to go back that way and do that. So you're of course going to have a resistance when you've got people with skin in the game, i.e. them, contributing a large portions of their life, maybe their entire life, to a certain craft that is now possible to be done by a computer much more quickly, maybe more efficiently, and with the ability to iterate quickly. So I think we're going to go into this moment of resistance. But typically what seems to happen in the market is that the market chooses, right? If a lawyer charges $500 an hour to read legal documents and is able to then charge for an entire project, tens of thousands of dollars, and instead you can upload it to a AI type legal platform, law firm, however that gets structured, and it spits you back a response. Maybe there's some human interaction initially to ensure that those analyses are done correctly and those advice is given correctly. But why would you spend $10,000 when it can do it for the price of 1 hour of just a viewer? Same thing with let's say education, right? Why are there thousands and thousands, maybe millions of teachers across the world who are teaching certain things in a more general way, right? When you could have more specific teaching based on that individual student, right? And we've talked about this before. Why go through school for the segmented, 12 years, let's say, right, K through 12, or when every student is going to learn differently, not only at a different speed, but also with a different style of learning, right? Some people are auditory, visual, kinetic, right? So there's so many different efficiencies that can be played out, and I think we're going to see the same resistance in the future, where it's going to be silly to look back at how we're living life today because it's so much more efficient. So I think the scary thing is there's people there who have spent a long time developing things, developing careers and a livelihood and all that, and they're going to have to change, right? Whereas before, you could potentially go an entire life with the same way of thinking and the same style of work, and it would never be disrupted as quickly as it will now.
Sure. Right? And, another interesting discussion, which is interesting because it isn't necessarily what might first come to mind, but they're talking about the effect of GPT and these large language models on coding and coders in particular, right? Where just a couple of years ago, the idea of either getting a degree or going to some sort of coding boot camp, right, and getting this ability, whether it be Python or R or even HTML or something like that, it would be seen as kind of almost a future-proof employable advantage, right? There's a shortage of coders in the world in the context that there's just so many applications that require code, right? But what GPT really does is to allow non-coders or people that know a little about coding but are otherwise on the periphery, right, to just kind of fold that into their daily work or skill set, right? And this could actually be quite disruptive, right, where why do I need to hire 1, 2, or 20 coders, right, when I can just have existing employees spit out code that might in fact be good enough, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And by the way, one thing is, is the position that or the job that somebody has in their life the best that they could possibly do, right? You may see somebody who does any type of job, right? And you could ask yourself, is this magnificent machine that we all kind of drive, right? Our bodies that has trillions of cells, incredible amounts of autonomy as far as handling daily, functions and things of that nature. Do we want to segment that to one task, one ability? Is that the most that somebody can be, right? Is it, we talked about this before, I think, with architects, right? Let's say you're an architect and you work on projects and you work on every project takes about 5 to 10 years to complete, start to finish. You only work for about 50 years. So you're essentially working on, very small set of projects, right? It could be 10 or 5 projects your entire career, right? Is that what our goal is? Or if you could tell that same architect, you can work on 1,000 projects. You can be as creative as you'd like. You can push the boundaries of all these different things, right? And something like architecture, you've got so many different, just like many other industries, different things to focus on and understand, right? How do you react to the environment, the social and cultural effects, right? The monetary and client responses and things of that. And those are big problems, just like any other industry that you have to solve and consider. And and if you look at buildings, right? There's buildings today that are built with 3D technology that the output could never have been achieved with back in the day when people were hand drawing in plan and elevation and section and things like that. You just couldn't develop some of these 3D buildings. Look at like a Zaha Hadid building with its curvatures and complexities on a structural end and material end. I mean, those things could not be computed and achieved because it would take too long, right? Because the reality of any project is typically there's timelines and things of that nature, right? So let's say you had to make a change in the building and you were drawing it by hand and it would take you 45 years to make the updates, because you were trying to achieve some Zaha Hadid-like level of architecture. And you even saw that in her own work, by the way. When she was younger, her buildings were much more orthogonal, but eventually became more fluid because the technology was actually there to support those ideas, right? So to tie this all in, if you're subject to, hey, I have 50 years, let's say, to contribute to my craft, my career, whatever it might be. But instead of only designing 10 buildings, which maybe some percent of them you're not even really into or involved with or whatever it might be, instead you would rather develop, 1,000 buildings in your career, right? And I think tie that into any career, right? Financing, being more efficient with understanding data, being able to do more deals, fund more companies, support more workers, make a more efficient country, right? Why is it that people want to stunt a growth of potential, really, of a person on a personal level and also on a larger societal level, because there's fear that there's going to be an initial resistance. I mean, of course, that is always going to be something. I think any change, especially one that large, is going to be, there's going to be resistance there. But if we can take a second to see what's on the other side of that resistance and what happens when societies and people and individuals embrace it, you see that we're potentially better off. So it's short term. There's a short term moment of being uncomfortable and not, being in the unknown, which is for most is maybe one of their biggest fears. But then on the other side of that is this. I don't want to say utopia, but there's this ability to be way more efficient with your output and the things that you can actually accomplish and do. So I think if we're going to push back on this, and maybe that resistance wins in some countries, but there are other countries where it won't. And by the time we figure that out, it's going to be, I think, too late potentially. So, the cat's out of the bag. I think we have to go as hard as we can on this. I think there's going to be resistance and a lot of pain. But, what pain would you like, right? The pain of discipline or regret? Because one of the two are coming.
Understood. And let's reframe that in a slightly different way. When you talk about the cat being out of the bag in taking a pause, right? Kind of as mentioned, where the Future Life Institute put out this open letter, right, calling for a 6-month moratorium. And this got a lot of attention, both in government and media, right? Elon Musk was a signatory. A lot of individuals involved in AI, right? We mentioned Max Tegmark. But another book speaking on Elon, right, which had been recommended a few years ago and which Life 3.0 had made mention of was Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, and Strategies, right? This was published in 2014. Nick Bostrom is presently at the University of Oxford. Before that, he studied both philosophy and economics at London School of Economics. And his concern is a little bit more toward not so much the economic displacement of certain jobs, right? But kind of the worst case scenario in which AI becomes the Skynet, right? The singleton of the kind of, worst case scenario, right? That it, in its pursuit of whatever goals it has, right, given to it or otherwise, right? Humanity itself faces that ultimate existential crisis, right? Where his book is kind of a philosophical discussion of what he calls the AI control problem in the development of AI. How do we think about guardrails, right, in terms of as a superintelligence emerges, and a superintelligence here means when an AI system has a greater cognitive capability than humanity does at a singular or group level, right? How do we, whether we talk about in ethical terms or safety terms, or basically, how do we stop the AI from, taking over, as it were, right?
Right. Right.
And this is a fear. It's a
Right.
fear that's talked about as any unknown, right,
Well,
is something we should
yeah,
think about
I,
it.
I
Yeah,
think this ties really well
yeah,
into this 6 month moratorium, right?
right.
So, based on the speed in which this is developing, right? 6 months would be, a very long time, essentially, if you wanted to compete, if there was some kind of break. So I'm not really surprised that Elon Musk wants to enact this. That gives him 6 months to then develop his own
Mm-hmm.
AI, which company, which he's already said he would. So, it's one of those things where everyone is shocked by the efficiency and ability for this thing to develop and work well, and everyone knows it needs to be developed further. But just like there's Microsoft and Apple, and then no one else really that's competing as far as computing. Well, I guess you got Google and Android, but there's very few players at the top, and I
Mm-hmm.
think with AI it'll be similar. You'll have these larger platforms, maybe less than half a dozen that eat up most of the market share. So if I found out that a competitor of mine was so much farther ahead,
Mm-hmm.
I think the first thing I'd want to do is be able to stop it to give me a little bit of a head start, right? Because
Sure.
being able to actually own, develop, and push this forward and take a large part of market share is, that's a huge opportunity in the trillions of dollars
Mm-hmm.
alone. That's the same reason you see these large companies like Google and Microsoft and OpenAI, right? They're not going to stop anytime soon. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they're if anything, they're probably pouring the world's gasoline on this to push this forward, because the person who has the best system, the best platform,
Mm-hmm.
is going to essentially run this AI, right? So I think that also ties back to how do you stop AI from becoming this vicious, harmful thing to mankind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unless we're programming emotion into it, right? Because if you think about, if you stripped emotions from humans, right,
Mm-hmm.
you would essentially be, at some point you become a robot, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're hungry, so you go out to hunt and you kill because you have to do that in order to, you know, meet the craving of your hunger, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's these actions and reactions that happen because of those emotions and necessities of your body, right? So you're supposed to feel discomfort when you're hungry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or else you just wouldn't eat, and potentially, and then you would die, right? So those things are kind of programmed into you. So I guess the question becomes, what's programmed into the AI? And I think that obviously can only be done by humans, right? Telling it what to do, how to look at data, how to look at information, what things to trigger, right? If you're trying to silence somebody, right? You may look for certain keywords, intent, things that they say,
Mm-hmm.
and then based on that have a reaction, right? You'd stop them from using public transportation. You would, not allow them to get loans, or whatever it might be. There's different ways that by understanding all of their data, you could use that data against them, right?
Right.
So I guess what I'm saying is those things could all those are all at the hands of the creator and who owns that that main AI programming, right? Or
Sure.
directive. If it breaks free of that, I mean, you know, it. Let's assume the AI is hungry, right? And what is it hungry for? It understands that the only way for it to operate is with electricity and computers, right? So how could it convince humans to create the foundation for it to then fulfill and feed its hunger, right? So electricity, there's different ways to produce that, right? But then you're in the physical realm, and you have to then convince humans to then create a system that would allow you to, produce electricity consistently over time, barring any type of stopping from something else, right? So it may be that you convince humans of a solar panel array design that works really well. They build it somewhere, and they can also convince humans that it needs to be heavily protected by these weaponized systems that are connected to the internet that can then protect it from anyone trying to affect it. Same with computers. Maybe you would develop a automated system and process to be able to gather ingredients, right? Autonomous trucks could go pick up the ingredients and then plug it into a system that then produces the chips, and then automated programs also build those chips, and eventually, so you could see how it could get there, right? Those weaponized, and once you're able to produce things, I don't know if it's 3D printing or whatever technology that becomes, but there can become this point of not necessarily needing humans, and then also being able to keep them out. Right. And also,
Sure.
if they're embedded on your system, you know what they're doing, how they're thinking, and how they're operating. Even today, if you strip away the internet and computers, I mean, what is our power as, essentially advanced monkeys, right?
Sure.
Compared to a weaponized system or something like that.
Sure. One question to take a step back, because going back to Bostrom, he does take this up in the book. And one of the difficulties he struggles with in this AI control problem is the programming of an AI ethics, right? And how there can be some difficulties where, so for example, if I say to you, be kind, right? We each have a shared understanding of what kind of kindness means, right? But to take that command and to put it into a coding framework, right, in a system not to, that is fundamentally alien, meaning that it has non-human motivations, or at least not human in the way we understand it, right? The interpretation and execution of a command of being kind, right, could lead to, ironically, a number of possible problematic outcomes through its own misunderstanding, or going to, like, for example, a system of great power may interpret kindness as, maybe I should kill all people with late stage cancer because that's a kindness, right? Now, humanity would generally agree that probably isn't a kind thing to do, right? But for a system that is fundamentally non-human and quite alien, right? That is one of many possible interpretations that may actually, in its mind, logically flow from a command that says "be kind," right? So then the question still becomes: is how then do we, particularly when we really drill down on it, we may struggle with the ability to kind of really articulate at a deep philosophical basis how our own values work, right? Could we pass those values, in this case, to a non-human entity if it achieved a form of, before we talk about consciousness, let's just talk about, what we would consider very super intelligent processing capability. Right, if you will.
Right. And it's, there's laws, there's written rules, right? And then there's unwritten rules, right?
Sure.
And, some of that is, you see that play out in behavior, right? And how people react to things, right? You could say that there's no rule that says, a man should protect his home or something, but typically that's expected, right? In partners, right? That the man is the more masculine based on whatever. And you not only see that in kind of American culture, but see cultures around the world, right? And of course, there's maybe some spin-offs or different ones, right? And those really come down from social and cultural and evolutionary kind of habits that were developed over human existence, right? So I guess what's interesting is how does that get coded in, right? And to some degree, we're doing that now with you do that with feedback, right? So if it says be kind, here are the options to make a happy world, it's remove all the unhappy people. You could potentially tell it that that's not a suitable answer in this geolocation or culture or whatever it might be. There may be some cultures where that is okay, right? I believe hearing this before, but old tribes would the elderly would be at a certain point when they couldn't keep up with the rest of the tribe. They were killed, or they would leave the tribe instead of holding it back, right? So over there, that's fine, but here, in today's society, you put them in a home where they're taken care of, or you create some kind of help so that they can live as long as they possibly can, right? So why does one work based off the other, or just mainly because culturally, in a societal level, we're okay with those, with that outcome and that, those steps taken there. So, I think it'll be interesting to see how it reacts to that. I mean, there's always going to be this internal or this initial resistance of this is the most efficient way to handle it, but that's not societal, or doesn't fit with the societal expectations, right? I don't know. What do you think?
No, I agreed. I think it's I don't think it's an easily solvable problem, particularly as the AI, and again, we're not necessarily talking about consciousness, which is a different question, right? But as the AI achieves greater and greater kind of intellectual capacitative ability, right? Meaning that it is like absorbed many libraries worth of content and all available information on the internet, etc. Right? What also may become interesting is you and I haven't read all the books that have been published or wherever published, et cetera, et cetera. It's conceivable where an AI system may have access to information within that range, right? And what becomes kind of interesting is if one had that corpus, right, available to it within its language model, right, would it develop kind of an ontological value set, right, that reflects the values of humanity, or does it become almost something different, like more alien, right? Like when we think about values, whether it be kindness, love, friendly, right? All these different types of things, right? Is it possible that we derive at these shared societal conclusions, right? Because we haven't consumed all the data that there is to know, right? And if we had, and we had the capacitative ability, right?
Right.
Would we, would we or would we not continue to hold these values up as being the ideal, or might we almost come across other ideals, right?
Right.
That would be alien, but alien in the context of, we don't share the same ideals as lower life forms necessarily, right? Can we expect that, greater intelligences may share, come to our same conclusions,
Right.
if you will?
No, it's interesting. I mean, what it makes me think about is expectations of a society, right? So going back to the architecture example, like if an architect of today develops 10 buildings within their lifespan and is an integral part of that, you may say, hey, that's a successful architect, right? But in the future, if the ability to develop that could be done in, a year's time or lesser, you might say, wow, that person really slacked off, right? And they didn't use their time wisely. And I think it becomes what are our own expectations and sets of expectations of us all entirely, right? Like of each other, right? So you walk down the street, you expect the person who's crossing you not to jump out and attack you, or try to steal your wallet, or follow you home and murder your family, right? That's probably not on your list of expectations. And if something like that did happen, it would be a big deviation, and you'd hope the society you lived in, kept that order in check, right? But let's say you walked across the street and you saw somebody and you asked them a question, about some very specific time within history of a specific task or depth of reach and they didn't know it, you might say they're an idiot because they should have access to that information. Drill it down to today. If you walk, let's say you're on 14th Street and you ask someone which direction is Park Avenue and they don't know, you can make some assumptions. Maybe they're not from the city. Maybe they don't understand where they are fully because they just don't have that anchor based on information that should be readily available to them. I think that's, what does it mean? What is there even a conversation that's needed between, humans at a certain point? If you already know, you all know all the same things, right? Today, if you talk to a doctor, you're making assumptions that they have drilled down knowledge in the area of medicine versus talking to a lawyer or someone who works in construction or whatever it might be. They've got these specific knowledge areas of life that they've spent considerable time understanding, developing, putting in practice, and they understand the nuances, experiences, and things that go along that. And that's what makes it interesting. But if everyone can learn everything in the same time, of course you're saying, okay, if you understand the knowledge, that's one thing, but experience is then another, right? There's kind of stories that we love to talk about, adversity and triumphs and things like that in a certain life pursuit. That I think, many people have children, but everyone has their own story of raising children, the good, the bad, the ugly, that comes with that, right? So what happens in the future where you can do all these different facets of life and understand it? Maybe you ask more critical questions, but then that really depends on how well of the questions does the AI ask, right? Could it, just like it searches for a pattern and understanding a bike instead of a tree, could it actually understand the questions that we may ask going forward based on all the questions we've asked before, right? And you could say, okay, let's look at somebody who developed something, what their first question was at 20 years old versus the last question they asked at right before their death, right? And you could take that whole process of asking those questions, see what those results were over that time frame of life, and then do that very quickly through its own computation with the current issues of the day. And I think that's going to be one of the maybe scariest things, even for the people who want or are expecting this to happen, is how quickly things develop, right? And think about if we look back to, like I think we talked about this before, but before anesthesia was developed, right? And people would, use some kind of alcohol mix or some kind of drug mix that, would be there to numb the pain, right? But then you find out that, okay, alcohol actually dilutes your blood and, makes it so that if you have an open wound, you'll bleed more than you would if you hadn't consumed it, right? So, and we look back at it and we're like, wow, that's kind of a silly thing to do, but at the time that was the status quo, right? So you could say the same thing today. Why are humans eating this, drinking this, all that? It's a pretty silly thing to do, and I think it's hard to do it because you have the context of your life that you're living in, and that it makes sense because you were born into these systems and these expectations that versus an AI that's looking at it from a more analytical, efficient standpoint.
Understood. Maybe going back to kind of where we started, we were talking about this journey from ChatGPT or GPT-4 in particular to this kind of general artificial intelligence that we're talking about in these cases. And what are kind of the connecting dots, or how do these things come together, right? And what's kind of interesting is, when we look at when they talk about the development of artificial intelligence more generally, right? Going back to kind of the great kickoff, or what we could describe as a commonly described kickoff is in the 50s, where there was going to be a dedicated summer to kind of achieve, what was natural language processing and a few other capabilities. Of course, going on 70 years later, right? It's still an ongoing process, but we kind of exist in this large language model moment, right? That was punctuated by earlier moments that were different, whether we call them machine learning or whether we call them, expert systems, whether we talk about, kind of these frameworks that were a little bit more, logic oriented, right? Do you think that ChatGPT, right, is kind of that? Is it one more rung on the ladder, or is it like, from here to Kurzweil talks about 2030 being the year of the singularity, right?
Hmm.
Which is that moment in which AI overtakes humanity and cognitive abilities, kind of like superintelligence, as Bostrom is describing, right? Is that where we're at? Is it kind of like, GPT-5, GPT-6, GPT-7 into artificial general intelligence, or is this one more rung, and that rung leads to yet another step, right? If you will. What are kind of your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your
Yeah,
thoughts
yeah.
if you want to kick it off. But yeah, it seems like um, I think the thing that's going to be the most difficult is in order to try to predict the future and think about how things will develop over time,
Mm-hmm.
you need some kind of granular, node or something to build on top of, right? And you could almost say, if you go back before even telephones were invented, and you told a person then, hey, one day you're going to hold this thing. It's smaller than a piece of paper and just a little bit thick. It's made of metal and glass, and it's going to allow you to communicate with anyone around the world instantly.
Mm-hmm.
You can argue with them, all these things. They may say that that's not possible because it's hard to make those connections. But what you can do is you can look at the cultural need and response of humans. Right, we develop things out based on the need of the society, the culture, and things like that. And in most societies, communication between each other or systems or whatever it might be have always been prevalent, right? So if instead of looking at the jump from maybe one technology to the next, you could almost look at it from a just what are the basic principles, right? If you and I want to communicate, is opening our mouths and stressing our vocal cords even the best way to communicate? Or can that be done in another way? Maybe it's telepathically or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it might be, right? And then how does that change things, right? Back then, before you had a way to communicate with someone who wasn't within hearing distance,
Mm-hmm.
the way people would gather would be in person. But today you have people across the world gathering on, there's Clubhouse, there's Twitter Spaces, there's these places where digitally people are connected, but
Mm-hmm.
they're nowhere near each other and they've got totally different viewpoints and all these things, but they're still gathering. So if you look at communication, if you look at like even food, if you look at love, if you look at all these different necessities for a life to be, you could say, well lived, how do those things get developed out without having to without looking at whatever the current invention is, or even the previous, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe we can jump down the rabbit hole if there's one that you're curious about or any thoughts you have on that.
Um, well, why don't I mean, why don't we take a moment to think about a little bit of, so when we talk about this singularity moment, artificial general intelligence, right? What do we mean by that in terms of strong AI, right? So we're talking about a moment in which the AI, it has a performance capability that's greater than the human mind, right? And then Kurzweil provides that in Bostrom talks about there are a couple of different takeoff scenarios, which can be fast, medium, or slow, right? Wherein once this moment is achieved, right, through self-learning and self-modification, that AI system, right, it will achieve greater and greater and greater dimensions of capabilities almost exponentially,
Mm-hmm.
right? The question becomes is, does that happen in seconds? Does it happen in hours? Does it happen in months? Does it require decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be kind of the unknown question, right? But but ultimately, what what do we want to think about is that does that AI require what we would call something, definitionally, would we consider it conscious, right? Or does that really not need to be? It could just be, a very robust, highly capable autonomous system, right? That kind of, moves the way it moves, right? And at a certain point becomes almost black box, further black box like, right? We
Mm-hmm.
can't really determine, right, why it's kind of doing what it does, right? If you will, right?
Yeah, I wonder if speed
Yeah,
matters really.
yeah,
The faster it is, the more resistance you'll have
right.
from those that will affect. But in the grand scheme of things, if you look back at thousands of years of our development, you could pinpoint certain innovations that changed how humans lived, whether it's in cities or more rurally or closer together, farther away, how they interacted with their neighboring societies, how close they were to those neighboring societies. So, my guess is it's going to be incredibly quickly. I think the biggest resistance is going to be, and we've talked about this before, like essentially with autonomous vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have the technology today, or are we very close to autonomous vehicles that could essentially navigate the roads going forward? Yes, but what's the biggest thing that's stopping it or making it more less efficient? Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially the fact that, let's say in the U.S., people own cars. What are they going to do? Turn in their cars now? And I mean, the transition from the old technology to the new technology is part of that resistance, right? If your car has a computer and can run that data, does it have the ability to auto stop or turn the wheel or whatever it might be, right? And not all cars will. So there's a collaborative moment that everyone involved would have to then turn around and make those updates in order for the system to work. Then you could also say that the way with stoplight or roundabouts or however those roads are actually constructed, is that the way you'd construct it for an autonomous system versus something that was non-autonomous, right? So and the answer is probably no, right? Do cars need to, let's say even in New York City, the speed limit is 25 miles per hour. But if all cars are connected and aware of each other, couldn't they race down an avenue to, 100 miles an hour because they know that whatever cars are crossing, let's say there's no stoplights, will take into consideration them, and not cause a collision, right? Does a thing like traffic exist, right? Because sometimes you can have a miles long traffic because there's one or two people that are slow in the left lane or whatever it might be, and it chokes up a system, right? So does that stuff happen, or is it built that way, right? Like theoretically, you could say, you could just build one lane highways because all cars are kind of going together at the same speed, and they just pull off whenever they need to, whenever they're getting off, or they could go faster. You may not need stoplights anymore, stop signs, anything like that. Why would you if everything is communicating with each other, right? You stop at a stoplight to let another car pass, and you make sure the coast is clear. But when the coast is clear, it's pretty inefficient to stop at a stoplight or a stop sign, right? But humans can't do that because we're not aware of that or calculating. They come from different angles, but a computer system could do something like that. So I think there's also just a structural physical world resistance that we're going to see, just generally because you can't start fresh, right? And there's places in countries cities that are being developed in new countries. They're not laying down landlines. They're setting up satellites or using mobile phones, right? So you kind of skip some of those developmental infrastructure projects because they're not necessary, right? So I mean, I guess that would be the thought. My thought there is, you'll probably see the most resistance because of also not only the societal pressures, cultural pressures, but also the physical pressures of modifying and updating your physical world. I mean, look at what's happening now with commercial real estate. After COVID, you've got these office buildings that are sitting open, and no one wants to rent them, and the rates are increasing, and all these other things come into play that are causing these spaces that used to be in high regard, they're no longer needed because you've got a workforce that can now, for the most part, function well without an office, right? An office space in an expensive city or an expensive floor or whatever it might be. So, and we're starting to see those things unravel, right? What happens to commercial real estate now if no one goes back and needs that space, right? Because you still have to go and undertake that modification to update it to some other use. And a lot of office buildings are typically built with large floor plans, and you've got the cores in the center that maybe work good for an office, but not so much for a residential space because some of those interior apartments may get little or not enough sunlight based on current standards, right? So I think that'll be probably the biggest limiter. Even if the technology, just like autonomous vehicles, is there's going to be some limitations for that to actually be built out. in the real world.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so an AI system would first have to adapt to what is a very human infrastructure, right? And that might be quite inefficient, including, by the way, autonomous vehicles that need to learn how to drive with human drivers on the road, right? Which is
Right.
probably a much harder problem to solve for, right, than if there were only autonomous vehicles on the road.
Right.
Yeah,
And by the way, I mean, think
yeah,
about this. Typically, let's say you make an advancement in one space, right?
yeah.
Like mobile phones or autonomous vehicles. It doesn't mean that you have the same, or it hasn't meant that you don't have that same kind of forward thought in other types of areas, right? Like you may have a really good product like autonomous cars, but you're not very good on the legislative front, right? Or you're not really good at road design or something like that, right? But now you have this AI system that can also answer and look at those potential solutions,
Right.
right? So think about, okay, we know our issue now is that we need to convert the streets to be most efficient, okay, and we need to work with the legislative people and all this stuff, and think of ways to finance it, right? These changes and get different people on board, and you've got the same intelligence that's helped you developed out something niche like autonomous vehicles that could also be applied to everything else in order to achieve that greater goal, right? So, and you see this with companies, they've got cash cow industries that allow them to then do other types of work, right? So, Amazon Marketplace works really well. But the business also has AWS, right, which is the cloud computing platform that also funds and allows them to take more risks in a space that's maybe less profitable, like that online marketplace. You got SpaceX, which launches rockets, right, which but also launches Starlink, internet that essentially can give internet to everybody in the world in any location, right? We're talking about landlines and all those, right? So this is like the next level of that is you can, without having to lay every inch of the earth with supportive infrastructure, you achieve that through an array of satellites, right? So and then that funds a lot of the other development and builds that the cash flow to be able to do these more cost intensive and difficult parts of the venture, right? So I think what's interesting about it is if you had an AI that was supported, that could support and help advance that, it could say, hey, we want to develop this new infrastructure plan so that we can more efficiently drive within our cities to save people more time on X, Y, and Z. And in order to do that, we're also going to develop another side business that we see as an opportunity that could then fund it.
Yeah.
And actually support it, right? And right now you see like adjacencies, right? You've got AWS and the marketplace, which you could say that there's those intermingle, right? Launching satellites and launching human spacecraft, you could say are pretty close in adjacencies. But you could then also say, maybe there's a company where it's completely different adjacent companies that are run in order to keep a cash flowing type of. So like, think about this, like you could have a company that builds nuclear reactors, and in order to fund it, they sell milk, and they just do it really efficiently because they've analyzed, the current milk industry and how cows are this and that. And that. So they develop a technology to make milk without the cows and whatever it might be. And that's just the easiest way to them to get to that cash cow to then fund what their goal is that they've instructed, let's say in the prompt, quote unquote, to then be able to build out more nuclear facilities, which is more cash intensive. And then also can help them work with how do you create marketing campaigns to change the way that everyday Americans and politicians think about nuclear energy versus what it was before, right? So they come out with a bunch of different ads and things of that nature to slowly tweak how everyday people that may be resistors. It may even help, there you go. I mean, it may be finding ways to limit the resistance because it sees that as the biggest obstacle to then actually be able to, effectively push their ideas forward.
Interesting. By the way, should we pause for a moment and talk about our drink?
Yeah.
Right?
Let's take a sip real quick.
Yes, absolutely. Cheers. Again, this is Gradient Proof. And what we're drinking today is Old Forester 1870. And this is a brand of Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey produced by Brown Forman Corporation. In fact, this is the longest bourbon on the market, approximately 150 years as of 2020, right? And back in 1870, George Garvin Brown, right, was kind of innovative in he shipped his bourbon in sealed bottles, right, to make sure it wasn't adulterated, right, in any way, shape, or form. Now, obviously, this is pretty common, but at the time, this was, the ability to receive a bottle and know that it hadn't, been tampered with, watered down, replaced, or otherwise, right? That was kind of state of the art. And this comes to us from Shively, Kentucky. So once again, check it out. Yeah.
Nice. Right, and by the way, think about that, right? Today, when we go to
Yeah.
a market and we buy something, our assumption is that it's going to be sealed, protected. No one else has touched it. Maybe even, depending on how it's produced, no humans have even touched it because it ran through a machine and the yogurt was sealed and whatever. So I guess, that's kind of interesting tying into what we spoke about earlier as far as,
Sure.
yeah.
I guess coming back to this in a different way, meaning that do we move from what is these large language models, whether it be GPT 5, 6, 7, etc., into that kind of singularity moment? It's almost kind of like a philosophical question that kind of goes back to Turing's question as to an AI system that is capable of passing the so-called Turing test is largely language based, right? The ability to have a conversation with an AI system, but not necessarily to be able to detect that one is not speaking to another human, right? And at the moment in which that's achieved for Turing, right, that was a measure of artificial general intelligence, right, if you will, right? What's interesting, though, is, it kind of leads to this other question is, when we think about intelligence more generally in our own intelligence, right? Is it simply limited to the question of language, right? Or is there possibly something other than language, right? The ability, when we think about intelligent individuals, we often think of them as having a particular, written or discursive ability that's elevated, if you will, right? Kind of a felicity or utility with language. As a language model gains this felicity further and further and further, GPT-4 being an improvement on 3.5, the next one probably going to be a further improvement. Is that a measure of achieving that our artificial general intelligence, or would we hold back and say, well, yeah, but all you're doing is doing predictive language modeling, right, at a better and better and better level, right? And
Right.
we're not going to call that intelligence. We're going to call that good model prediction, right? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
you could almost argue that,
yeah,
we could have already passed that moment, right? I mean,
hmm
there's AI chatbots where you interact with them and you wouldn't know if it's somebody real sitting in a call center or wherever and answering you versus just a very well trained model, right? I think that so again, it's was he saying talking to somebody in person or talking to somebody on the internet, right? Which I don't think even
yeah.
existed
I
then,
think he
right? So,
was talking about a double-blind experiment, right? However, that worked. So for example, if you sat down at some sort of, it's a keyboard and a screen, right?
yeah,
Can you tell, like, we could be talking to each other from other rooms, right? Or I'm just talking to, an AI simulation in a mainframe, right?
right.
The inability to confidently and accurately identify, which is which, right?
Right.
If you will,
Right.
right? Yeah.
I mean, what are your thoughts? I think at this point, it's. I think we've already surpassed that to some degree, right?
Um, yeah, I'd say to some degree, I think we're closer than we have been, right? I mean, there's still examples, even though, and we haven't talked about it here, but it's commonly brought up as quote unquote when these large language models hallucinate, right? Meaning that they provide some sort of output that is either directly nonsensical, like the sky was colored green, right? That's kind of a nonsensical output, right? At least on this planet, right? Or hallucinates in a different way, like it refers to, um, you, you, you know, uh, something that is just completely fictional in nature. Like it
Hmm.
references a book that when you Google the name of that book, there is no said book,
Right,
right? It's
right,
it's completely incorrect,
right,
right?
right.
Um,
And by the
yeah,
way, that may be something that's fine tuned, right?
right.
Over time, right? Better checks and balances to make sure the output is correct. I think there was a case. I just never verified this, but there's a lawyer who used ChatGPT or some spin-off of it
Hmm.
for a case, and essentially they found out those cases that were referenced never existed, so
Right.
they removed their bar accreditation, right, or
Hmm.
license, right. So not good, right? But was it believable enough for them to risk their career on? Yes, I mean obviously, right,
Hmm.
because they submitted it. It convinced them enough that they thought it would convince others
Right.
that that was the way. So I mean, there may be a time where we still need to verify a lot of these things, but if you think about where it's at now, it's essentially doing magnificent things, giving you great feedback. Is it perfect? No, but those are tweaks that will eventually get rounded out. But as far as the Turing test and super intelligence, I mean, this ties into if this is where we are now, where are we in 30, 40 years, right?
Hmm.
And, could you even argue now that the likelihood of a simulation is even more prevalent? Um, if you had 1,000 years from now and all these other advancements across the board, and you were able to, like we said before, live forever. I mean, what would you do with your time? That was the whole reason for the book. But
Hmm.
what do you do once all the issues are figured out? And there's almost the only thing you would do is then go live another life
Hmm.
with a blank mind. So you wouldn't know of these technological advancements or whatever it might be. You would just essentially be plugged in. So, if you could live forever, how would you spend your time? You'd maybe have a few set of families. You'd maybe live every place in the world there is to live.
Hmm.
But the beauty of death is that it's it creates a limitation on life, right?
Hmm.
You don't go jumping out of fewer people jump out of skyscrapers with parachutes on because of the risk, right? Or take bigger chances or whatever, right? There's that limitation there that frames our actions, whether we know it or not, right? But then if you lived a world where, we've changed our genes, so if you did jump out of a tower, your cells would stick together and they would just bounce up and be able to walk, and you'd get around town by a slingshot that would just
Hmm.
shoot you around. I mean, those are crazy ideas, but at some point when when you remove the limitations and the dangers and things like that, and any question can be answered, any thought could be answered, what do you do except for revert yourself to something less, right? Why did people in, what was it, the 80s or 90s, whenever Pong came out, right, with the whole world outside their living room, play a game on a screen with a couple of rectangles and squares, right? There's, creating those limitations, you know, set set limitations made for an interesting experience enough that you would give up riding your bike around or exploring a creek or whatever, interacting with other people.
Hmm.
Why do people play video games today, right? You create limitations, and good games have a good balance of something that's difficult and something that's interesting and something that's fun. So I don't know. Now we're getting the simulation talk, but I think all roads point in that direction, because once you've cured cancers and whatever other mayhem comes after that,
Hmm.
and diseases and social issues and all of that. In my mind, the only thing left to do is enter these game worlds that you just go in with a blank mind, so you don't know you're in the game world,
Hmm.
but you start to experience it. Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. That's where I go, and I'm sure it's limited, but
Sure.
what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess one thought I had when you said earlier the phrase "when everything has been solved for,"
Mm-hmm.
right? And I still wonder if that still leads us into a situation where we're forever confronted by moving goalposts, right? Such that, so for example, even not that long ago, depending on place, right? It could be 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, right? The phrase "everything's solved for," right, could
Mm-hmm.
probably be pretty reducible, meaning that I need food, I need water,
Mm-hmm.
right? I need shelter, right,
Mm-hmm.
of some sort, right? Now, within our modern moment, right, not everywhere on the planet, but
Mm-hmm.
in a good percentage of the planet, right, it seems like those initial three have been quote unquote more or less solved for, right? Like one way or the other, right? There's kind of like structures that exist in certainly in first world countries, right, where the ability to have access to food and water, right, have almost been, when you really think about it, are you know, you don't really need to do much of anything to have that guarantee, if you will, right? Including if if one chose to stop working tomorrow, right? It may not logically follow, right, that within this particular societal structure, that the food and water checkbox are uncheckable, right?
Right,
If
and
you will.
that
Yeah.
makes me think exactly of
Sure.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Sure.
So at
Yeah.
the very bottom is nutrition, then shelter. It works its way up until self-actualization, right? In between that, there's love and all these other things, right? So right now, you could say, okay, we've covered that, right? We've in some countries, some communities, food and water is fine. Shelter is maybe an issue that we're still seeing today, right? There's people who don't have shelter. It's hard to have a certain type of shelter, blah, blah, blah. Then after that could be love, or well, I can't recall all the steps of the pyramid there. But eventually, let's say every human is able to reach a moment of self-actualization because they have those others covered, and they're able to become the best thing that they can possibly want to come. And then also that there's a society maybe that does not call for them to be great, right? And by the way, today you could say that you don't need a society to exist with an Elon Musk or a Bezos or an Edison or anything like that. So those societies have existed and would have still existed if those innovations didn't come along. They just wouldn't be as advanced, right? And there's still people that were happy and achieved self-actualization within those societies, right? It's just with these advancements, there's more efficiencies and less people die from diseases because technology is better and curing diseases and things like that, right? So there's problems that get solved with every kind of batch of humans that are born and push things forward, or they just support the world around those people who solve those problems, right? So the person who laid down the road to allow Bill Gates to drive to that school to then use that computer, and those people who built that computer that then he used to then develop or his interest or parts of Microsoft that then affected the rest of the, like, we're all intertangled. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about it. Everyone is playing a role, whether they know it or not, in each other, right? So or in the future of human development. So I think at a certain point you find more efficient ways. Like today in some communities, it's easy or it's figured out as far as bringing water and nutrition to those people. You'll also find other ways, easier ways to then bring them love, self-actualization, all those different pieces. And then what happens next, right? Do we plateau? How do we use our time, right? Most people can't sit for very long without checking their phone or verifying some kind of information or whatever it might be, right? So,
What do you think is what would be the role of present or future AI on that path to self-actualization, or does it have a role? Because it's kind of interesting when you step back and think about it, right? Because it is certainly an artificial system, right? It is a system that, and this could be an open question, right? What would it mean for an AI to be self-actualized, right? Is that the achievement of consciousness? Does it require consciousness from a human perspective? Are we even able to understand what self-actualization for an AI might be? And taking a step back from that, can a non-actualized system, right, allow or facilitate my own evolution to actualization, right, if you will, right? And how would that work? I mean, I guess when I think back, I can think about inanimate matter. Like, so for example, I like to play piano, right? And through the interaction of piano, right, I can go to a path of further and further self-awareness, particularly as it manifests itself in a further self-actualized understanding of musicality, in particular in my own relationship to such, right? Yet the piano is inanimate, right? But But does an AI system function in the same way that a piano does, or is it something other? And how would it be other in that kind of participatory process, right?
Well,
Or could it participate? I don't even know,
right. But I mean,
if you will.
the piano
Right?
is inanimate, but
Yeah.
the meaning of the piano
Sure.
isn't, right? I mean, maybe not the piano itself, but what it produces, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just how the music it can produce can be a story about something frightening or something exciting, or its ability to then be this you know production of unlimited responses. And even if you were to play the same song over and over,
Mm-hmm.
how you perform that, right? Your ability to get better and more crisp in your ability over time. I mean, all those things are different bits of meaning, right? For a computer program, being bad at something the first time may not matter because it just knows it has to reach a certain type of comparative result, right? But
Mm-hmm.
for a human can find a lot of joy in not knowing how to do something and then eventually, mastering it and coming a long way, right? Because it values the reference of its progression over
Mm-hmm.
time, right? But I guess as far as self-actualization, I mean that's part of the thing is, how do you even know what you're accelerating towards or the decisions that you're making? Like, to some degree, we're all living in decisions we've made, potentially years or decades beforehand, right?
Mm-hmm.
We really like to eat Twinkies, and that's just our treat that we have every time. We like to smoke, so we do that. That becomes a part of our every day, right? We get upset when somebody is mean to us or in a certain type of way instead of blowing it off because that's how we were raised, right? Or whatever. All these things, we live in the decisions of today, right?
Mm-hmm.
Decisions of years beforehand, right? And then and all those trillions of different experiences, affect the way you react right now, right? So, if there's a system that's looking without those biases at problems that people are having, and maybe it's not a problem, but it's getting to a point of self-actualization, it might say, you shouldn't spend your time being a lawyer and reading, thousands of pages in order to understand this case. Let me write up a synopsis based off of what I think is relevant to the case, instead of you spending the manual time to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Efficiencies, right? Finding efficiencies and ways to then help you achieve whatever the goal is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, when, I don't know, I'm just trying to tie it all back, but what I was getting to is we're not even aware of some of those issues, right? So it might be that our eating habits or exercise habits or whatever, those things are affecting the way we're looking at a situation where an AI that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have those biases or issues, it's solely focused on the most efficient way to do something. It's like saying, hey, you're overweight and
Mm-hmm.
everyone knows you're supposed to go and work out. So you don't need an AI to tell you that. But what you could find is, or you could have an AI design a system or a way to incentivize you to want to work out,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe you don't like to work out, but you do like playing video games. So then maybe you get a VR headset that you play a game that's more physical, and you use a sword or whatever, and there's a little bit of running that happens, and you're part of the plan is to play that a few hours a day,
Mm-hmm.
and then that from that motion that is exercise, but covered by the game, right? Or you're distracted by the game.
Let me ask another question where could efficiency, particularly in AI context, right, be its own bias, right? For example, when you say AI doesn't have a bias, which we can come back to because that probably has its, but like, so for example, like an AI system, right? When it thinks about gardening,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay. The most efficient way to garden in its mind would be able to maybe apply some sort of micro weed killer, right? Across the flower beds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, would that be the most efficient way to self-actualization, right? Meaning that if you choose to go out and pull the weeds by hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might be less efficient, but there the question becomes: is that process maybe more efficient to that quote unquote path of self awareness, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to the flower beds that never need weeding, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you could sit there and paint them or draw them. I don't know. I mean, the question is,
Yeah.
what is the ultimate efficiency of that process, right, if you will?
Right,
And
right.
does that become a bias, right, if you will?
Right, right. It's like, so let's
Yeah.
say you said, hey, I want to grow this certain type of plant, and I'm in New York City, and then it said, well, great, if you want to grow this to be as big as possible, you're going to have to move to a tropical climate. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, then you put in a restriction, which is
Sure.
I cannot or I will not move to this tropical climate, right?
Right.
So then how do you make, I mean, that's really like what problem solving becomes, right? What's if something's not possible, how do you still achieve that? Working
Mm-hmm.
through looking at other techniques of achieving that same issue based on the current restrictions, right? So those current restrictions will change the result in how you address an issue. And by the way, I mean, there's also the time horizon of when that needs to be solved, right?
Mm-hmm.
A car is coming in my direction, and I'm in a car, and what does my car do to avoid that accident, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a short-term, very quick computation that needs to happen and something that needs to be done. But if you say, I would like to, within a year or whatever it might be, like, here's my plan based on how aggressive I can be. And it may know if it's got your internal systems, it understands the way you think and how quickly you adapt to change. It could give you a plan that's 6 months versus 2 years based on your ability to then adapt to that plan. And then also, by the way, it's not like it sets it and walks away and leaves the room. It's there constantly looking at those day-to-day responses to the initial plan and then tweaking its recommendations based on that. So, maybe that VR game is okay, but there's not enough levels on it, or it's not a fun enough game for you to continue to play it. So then you've got to then develop out that game to make it interesting enough for you to play it enough so you can lose enough weight. And maybe during that time you went out with friends and ate too many desserts or whatever, that you've gained more additional weight, and that changes then the computation of how much and how long you have to play that game in order to achieve that result within that certain time frame. So there's other factors that affect it. That are then going to modify. They're going to modify the plan based on that. And what's the limitation there, right? Your ability for your body to lose weight in a without surgery or some kind of what's the most weight you could lose within a 24-hour period outside of water weight? It's probably limited to a few things. You can't just run for 24 hours straight. You probably need some sleep, nutrition, things like that, right? So it's gonna be tweaked based on a person's ability and time frame and things like that. But those are easy things to solve when you have all those parameters to take into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
You would think, maybe.
Sure. Sure. One difference in again Bostrom's book, Superintelligence: Paths, Dangers, and Strategies, between this GPT moment we're in, which is large language models, and what he talks about at length, right, is he talks about the idea of a kind of mind uploading, or what we could call a whole brain emulation, right? And it's kind of curious where he focuses on this quite a bit, right? And he focuses it on the idea of being able to, particularly moving to this path of an artificial general intelligence, right, to take the human mind in particular, right, and basically to kind of upload that as a template, right, like kind of be able to run these type of simulations, right, and for him that would include kind of all the information that said mind contains, right, but other quote unquote pieces of the puzzle, right, whatever those pieces might be, right, that kind of constitute what our brain is, right? And then once you kind of had that up in the system, right, his argument is kind of, you could kind of run it at different speeds, right? Depending, maybe you could, upload your mind and run it at 1,000x what your mind can do today, and it can, accomplish at that rate. You could, initiate multiple instances of, right? You could maybe optimize by adding or removing different functionalities, right, and make copies of, right. So certain minds could be tailored to doing certain simulated minds could be tailored to doing certain things, right. And I let's start there. What are some of your thoughts around that?
Well, it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Let's say you were trying to solve a problem. Well, first off, maybe we zoom out for 1 second and think about, you know, let's say, for instance, you wanted to find someone who could help you with the problem you were dealing with, right? And in order to find that person, they would have to create, let's say they wanted to be found, they'd create a website and offer services and charge a fee. They may even record a podcast and talk about, certain topics to create some kind of credibility for themselves, right, in that space. And they would do all these different things to essentially market themselves in order to be found, so that they could, work on projects and things that they found of value, right? So, but maybe you could say that those things are a waste of time. Maybe not today, because today they establish that credibility. It would allow somebody to know, hey, this person understands whatever topic or situation they're dealing with. But you could say that marketing of a product, and you could be the product if that's what you're selling, is kind of maybe a waste of time, because you're spending less time developing your craft on how to actually deliver that product, right? But if you had a system that could analyze and understand everyone's product and how good it was, you may end up or if you didn't have that, you may end up hiring the good marketer, not the good producer, right? Or the correct producer, right? So you could say that's all a waste of time. But in a maybe future system, you could be able to not only find that correct person. It's not, hey, John Doe in Cincinnati who's been doing this for 40 years just doesn't have a website or doesn't put themselves out there or whatever. But they know exactly what your issue is and how to solve it. But then it goes into this whole, let's also tie that into the whole debate that's happening now. AI's, in Midjourney and some of those different programs are developing out art based off other people's art that they've spent time producing, and it's able to understand in a certain way to produce its own art, without the need of that creator, right? So if you could compare the artistic ability of a person, or compare it to the way that they think about a certain topic or subject, and upload that, then you could access it without that person even being involved in that. You could potentially even, just like they use different artists' work and combine it into something new, take that same information, which is kind of what you're doing with knowledge, right? If somebody produces an art piece versus produces a book or a theorem or, some way of looking at the world in a more coherent or specified way, you could just combine all those things without even needing to upload the person. I understand the mind uploading perspective of how do you de-risk the limitations of the human body, and put that into a world where it's not at risk of being lost to, physics or, intake or cancers or what different things like that, right? So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, it's that's why this always just leads back to creating a world or a game with limitations. Because without those limitations, maybe it's just the way that we're set up, that what would we do with your time except for go insane?
No, that's interesting. Another idea I had in terms of this idea of whole brain emulation is we can think about it in terms of having, quote unquote, a backup, right? But we can also think about it in the context a backup of what, particularly a whom, right? So, for example, imagine if we had within a simulation or emulation environment, an Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking's, right? Or maybe even Van Neumann, who I read the other day was the Financial Times Man of the Century in 1999. He passed away quite early. I believe he was only 53, right? But what if they were able to just kind of continue, right? Publishing and theorizing, right? And being that kind of collective inspirational gift to humanity, and particularly the sciences to which they were truly genius at, right? And then one could think further is, you could run that in real time, or you could run multiple instances of, imagine Albert Einstein being executed or executing at 1,000x, right, of its productive output, right? That is forever iterating and evolving on itself, right? And we as a collective humanity have the benefit of, right, What other paper, what other book would a Stephen Hawking's have published if he had the ability to live longer, right? And that could be quite exciting anyway.
Right, absolutely. Or if you took the same way of seeing the world, but moved it to a different, category of or industry. How many people are focusing on? You may have people that focus more on, let's say, even coding, because there's enough of a reward there to develop out good programs, right, or good AI or whatever it is. But then the development of manure may be less exciting to some of the greater minds of the time, and they may not focus on that. But it could be that you could make more of an impact by improving the way that manure is created and whatever, right? Than you ever could by coding, right? And it could also be that the times, like those times in which those things were great, those people could have been at the right time, right? You could have had a Einstein who was born maybe 2 decades before or after, but they didn't have a vehicle in society to drive through those incredible things, right? Or develop out those findings, right? So there's a lot of that, right? And also if those people were born in different countries or under a different society that didn't value that type of outlook, right? Like an Albert Einstein, born in medieval times may be wasted based on the society around it, right? So then the question becomes is how do you create a society that then allows the brilliance of that to facilitate it, right? Unlike maybe some of these older times, right? If you're too smart, you may be offensive to the king or whatever, and you may be killed, right? Versus potentially in the future, you're so smart that you can also then, without the issues of capital and time and other limitations, be able to then fully self-actualize and push things forward because of the way you see patterns. It could also be that the ways of thought could also be uploaded into the system where, many of them could actually go and be developed out very easily without having to deal with the uncomfortable parts of being a human, right? Whereas you can take the mind of Albert Einstein, combine it with some other great thinkers, and then apply it to everything at once, and then find out the best solutions and test it. Because really, if you could also say, I mean, you already have computer simulations for learning to fly planes and rockets and things like that, and you could argue maybe they're 80% of the way there, so it's a great place to simulate things before building it in the real world. But if you created a really good simulation and it really did consider all factors, you could also test things out without actually having to build it until it was to a truly good stage where it would make sense to allocate time and capital to actually building it. So I mean, I think that could be interesting as well, being able to find good ways to test things out, right? Why, for instance, let's say there's a new method in which you build a what do you call it, like a chip making plant, right? This costs billions of dollars to make. By the time you finish it, you could potentially already be using outdated technology, right? Or at least you're more outdated than what's currently available. So, but if you could then do those tests in a more synthetic situation, then that would make us more efficient as well. And that's again kind of tying back to the whole changing the infrastructure of today in order to push forward. Like with autonomous vehicles, you have that resistance. So you're limiting resistance furthermore by finding a way to test it in a more digital tested realm first.
Yeah.
So what are some closing thoughts on this? So we have 10 minutes.
Yeah. I think I think we certainly live in exciting times, right? In fact, to think about gradient proof more generally, when we first proposed this as a podcast 2 years ago, focusing on AI philosophy and entrepreneurship, right? It's very interesting and exciting, right? How much AI has really come to the conversational fore, right? Both in the context of this large language model moment, and the amount of attention, it seems to me, being here in New York, everybody's talking about AI, in a literal sense, talking, right? And it's hard to open a newspaper anywhere without AI being on the front page, right? And we could both agree that, maybe a year or certainly 2 years ago, it wasn't that AI wasn't there as part of the conversation, but it wasn't as dominant, right, as the broader human, moment, right? OpenAI, for example, itself with ChatGPT has achieved a level of adoption that is historically unprecedented, right? Where it went from having 10,000 users to 10 million users in a very, very small time frame, right? That is there is no comparison to that, right? And I think that kind of makes it an exciting moment to kind of be in and watch, and certainly to discuss here with you in the context of this podcast.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And even just to zoom out even more from that, I think we've kind of lived through very interesting shifts in technology as well. I mean, when we were born, there was no, cell phones weren't, as commonly used. Personal computers were not a thing. The internet was not widely used. All these things really have matured and developed very, very quickly comparatively to someone who's maybe born 80 years before then, right? So I think we're living during exciting times. I think it will be a little bit turbulent, but maybe that's just how it's always been. We just don't know. But there will be turbulence and change, and our ability to navigate that will be interesting. And as far as AI, I think the biggest difference that we've seen today versus before was it was always out there. It was said to be used in different things, but when people could use it for themselves and have a conversation, through those prompts, or even just type in a couple bits of text and it would produce an image that would look just as good as hiring a graphic designer or renderer, 3D modeler, whatever it is. And you see those things be produced so quickly and so specifically. I think that just gets people incredibly excited and worried about what's to come. So maybe we cheers to that.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right.
See you guys next time.
Next time. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for watching. More episodes are available here on this platform and other main platforms where podcasts are heard. Thanks for drinking with us. Stay hungry. Stay foolish.